On the evening of April 7th, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. would suspend bombing. Both sides would negotiate a permanent deal in Islamabad. Trump called it a big day for world peace. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said nearly all war objectives had been achieved. Markets surged. Oil dropped 16% in a single day. The Dow had its best day in a year. The world exhaled. 6 days later, the United States imposed a military blockade on every Iranian port. CENTCOM announced it at 10 a.m. Eastern on April 13th. Every vessel entering or departing Iranian coastal areas is now subject to interception, diversion, and capture. The blockade covers the entirety of the Iranian coastline, both the Persian Gulf side and the Gulf of Oman. It applies to ships of all nations, regardless of flag. Iran called it piracy. Thousands marched in Tehran. The IRGC warned that if Iran's ports are threatened, no port in the Persian Gulf will be safe, and the ceasefire that was supposed to give both sides time to negotiate is now the backdrop for the most aggressive naval escalation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The sequence of events that led here is worth understanding, because it happened fast. On Saturday, April 11th, Vice President J.D. Vance sat across from Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Islamabad for the first face-to-face talks between American and Iranian officials since the war began. Pakistan's army chief was in the room. The talks lasted 21 hours. They failed. Vance said Iran rejected what he called America's final and best offer. He said the main sticking point was nuclear. Iran refused to give up its right to enrich uranium. Iran's spokesperson said the U.S. was making excessive demands and looking for an excuse to leave. The Financial Times reported the real deadlock was the Strait of Hormuz. Iran insists on maintaining control and collecting transit fees. The U.S. considers that a non-starter, 21 hours of direct diplomacy produced nothing. Vance flew home, and within hours, Trump announced the blockade. The legal distinction matters. Under international law, a blockade is an act of war. The Newport Manual on the Law of Naval Warfare defines it as the use of naval force to prevent vessels from entering or leaving enemy ports. The last comparable U.S. naval operation was Cuba in 1962, when President Kennedy ordered the Navy to prevent Soviet ships from delivering missiles to the island. Kennedy deliberately called it a quarantine rather than a blockade, specifically because a blockade is legally an act of war. Trump's administration has used the word blockade openly. That distinction is not accidental. That crisis brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. The comparison is not exact, but the mechanism is identical. Use naval power to strangle an adversary's supply lines and force a political concession. Kennedy wanted the missiles removed. Trump wants Iran to give up nuclear enrichment and relinquish control of Hormuz. In both cases, the blockade is the pressure tool designed to make the other side accept terms it has already rejected at the negotiating table. The United States and Iran are technically in a ceasefire. A ceasefire means hostilities are paused. A blockade is a hostile act. Both things cannot be true at the same time. The U.S. position is that the blockade only targets ships going to and from Iranian ports, not ships transiting the strait to non-Iranian destinations. CENTCOM explicitly stated that it will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. In other words, the U.S. is saying, we're not closing the strait. We're just making sure Iran can't use it. Iran sees no difference. From Tehran's perspective, the U.S. started a war, agreed to a ceasefire, failed to negotiate a deal, and then imposed an economic chokehold that will cost Iran an estimated $435 million per day. That doesn't look like a ceasefire. It looks like a siege. The economic pressure is calculated and severe. More than 90% of Iran's annual seaborne trade, roughly $110 billion, transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has no significant alternative trade routes. Its rail connections are limited. Its overland borders with Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, and Afghanistan can handle a fraction of its trade volume. The blockade cuts Iran off from its oil revenue, its petrochemical exports, its food imports, and its industrial supply chains simultaneously. One analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies estimated that the blockade makes continued resistance economically impossible. If Iran cannot offload its crude oil, it will be forced to shut down oil wells, and once wells are shut down, restarting them causes permanent damage to the reservoir. The longer the blockade lasts, the more irreversible the economic damage becomes. The U.S. Navy's operational challenge is enormous. Enforcing a blockade of the entire Iranian coastline requires constant presence. Former U.S. Navy Captain Carl Schuster estimated that at least 6 destroyers would be needed inside the Gulf, with 2 conducting boardings and 4 providing protection against Iranian counterattacks. Each boarding requires a team of 10 to 14 sailors to physically take control of a merchant vessel, install an officer to act as the ship's captain, and guide it to an anchorage or port for detainment. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is in the region, along with at least 7 guided missile destroyers, the Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group with a Marine Expeditionary Unit, and additional destroyers in the Red Sea and Arabian Sea. The infrastructure for the blockade exists, but Iran's ability to contest it also exists. Iran's military has been degraded by 6 weeks of strikes, but it is not eliminated. The IRGC still possesses anti-ship cruise missiles launched from mobile platforms along the coastline, positioned in mountains and concealed positions that are difficult to target from the air. It has surface drones and aerial drones that can be deployed quickly from positions along Iran's southern shore. It has fast attack boats, smaller and harder to detect than the warships hunting them, capable of swarming tactics that have concerned U.S. naval planners for decades. The IRGC's fast attack strategy is designed specifically for the strait. Launch dozens of small, fast, expendable boats carrying missiles and explosives at a handful of large, expensive warships. The math is uncomfortable for the U.S. A destroyer costs nearly $2 billion. A fast attack boat costs a fraction of that. And there are the mines. The U.S. destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying boats during the war, but the number of mines actually planted in the strait remains unknown. 2 U.S. destroyers entered the strait on Saturday to begin clearing them. Underwater drones will follow, but clearing mines from a 21-mile-wide waterway while enforcing a blockade and protecting against coastal missile attacks is the most complex naval operation the U.S. has attempted since the Iraq War. A Korean defense analyst called it high risk. That's an understatement. Trump's rhetoric has been characteristically aggressive. He posted on Truth Social that he had instructed the Navy to seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. He also threatened to use drug boat-style attacks against Iranian fast attack ships, a reference to operations in the Caribbean where U.S. forces have intercepted suspected narcotics vessels. He claimed the U.S. has completely destroyed Iran's military and that all of Iran's mine-laying boats are at the bottom of the sea. Both claims are disputed by analysts and denied by Iran. But the signal is clear. The U.S. intends to take physical control of the strait and eliminate Iran's ability to generate revenue from the waterway, whether through tolls, controlled passage, or oil exports. The international response has been mixed and revealing. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed support for the blockade. Spain's defense minister called it nonsensical and said it was another episode in a downward spiral that has dragged everyone in. The UK's Prime Minister said Britain would not join the blockade and would not be dragged into the war. Trump, already frustrated that NATO allies refused to support the war militarily, said they were tested and failed. The alliance system that underpinned American power in the Gulf for decades is fracturing in real time. The U.S. is enforcing a blockade that none of its major European allies support, against a country that China and Russia have publicly backed, during a ceasefire that nobody agrees on the terms of. The coalition of the willing, this time, is a coalition of one. That is the escalation risk that most coverage is understating. The blockade isn't just about Iran, it's about every country that does business with Iran. China imports millions of barrels of Iranian crude every month. During the war, Chinese ships were the only vessels transiting the strait freely, paying tolls in yuan through Iran's controlled channel. China's Ministry of Commerce publicly acknowledged the use of yuan to settle payments in the strait. Iran's embassy posted that it was time to add the petro-yuan to the global oil market. An entire parallel trading infrastructure was built during 5 weeks of war. If the U.S. blockade applies to Chinese ships carrying Iranian crude, Beijing faces a choice that could reshape the global order. Accept the interdiction, which means allowing Washington to dictate who China can trade with, or challenge it, which means Chinese vessels directly confronting U.S. warships. Neither option is simple. Neither is without consequences that extend far beyond this war. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the blockade a threat to everyone's common interests and urged the international community to intensify peace efforts. But diplomats don't stop blockades. Ships do. Iran's response so far has been verbal, but specific and deliberately threatening. The Iranian military said that if the security of Iran's ports is threatened, no port in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea will be safe. That's not a vague warning. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain all have major ports within range of Iranian missiles. Saudi Aramco's Abqaiq facility, which processes roughly 5% of global oil supplies, was hit by an Iranian drone hours after the ceasefire was announced. If Iran strikes Gulf port infrastructure in retaliation for the blockade, the energy crisis doesn't just continue, it gets permanently worse. Damaged oil terminals take years to rebuild. Iran's state broadcaster also referenced Bab al-Mandeb, the narrow strait between Yemen and Africa that connects the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. The implication is clear. If the U.S. blockades Iran's ports, Iran can activate its Houthi allies to close a second choke point. The Houthis already attacked commercial shipping in the Red Sea throughout 2024 and have entered the Iran war by striking Israel. If Bab al-Mandeb is closed while Hormuz remains contested, 2 of the 3 critical maritime choke points for global trade would be under threat simultaneously. The Suez Canal becomes useless if Bab al-Mandeb is blocked. Iran's armed forces branded the blockade a criminal act of piracy. The IRGC said Iran still has unused capabilities and could deploy new tactics if the conflict deepens. These are not idle threats from a defeated military. They are signals from a country that still has leverage and is calculating how much of it to use. Pakistan, the country that brokered the ceasefire and hosted the talks, is now trying to prevent a complete collapse. Prime Minister Sharif said the ceasefire is holding and that Pakistan is in active contact with both sides. Efforts are underway to arrange a second round of talks before the ceasefire expires around April 22nd. But the window is narrow. The blockade is operational. Iran's revenue is being strangled daily. The IRGC is threatening retaliation. And the U.S. has framed its offer as final. There is no obvious path to a deal that satisfies both sides on the fundamental question, who controls the Strait of Hormuz? 6 weeks ago, the U.S. and Israel launched the war to destroy Iran's military capability and prevent it from building a nuclear weapon. 5 weeks in, they achieved a ceasefire that was supposed to lead to a permanent settlement. The ceasefire lasted 6 days before the U.S. imposed a blockade that is, by any legal definition, an act of war. The bombs stopped. The economic strangulation began. Iran is now being strangled economically, with its ports blockaded, its oil revenue cut off, its infrastructure damaged by 6 weeks of strikes, and its coastline under surveillance by the most powerful navy on Earth. The U.S. Energy Secretary said oil prices will keep climbing until meaningful ship traffic gets through the strait, and he expects that to happen in the coming weeks. But meaningful traffic requires either Iran's cooperation or Iran's defeat. Neither is guaranteed. Whether that pressure produces a deal or a wider war depends on decisions being made right now in Tehran, Washington, Beijing, and Islamabad. The ceasefire clock is still running, but the blockade doesn't have a clock. It runs until someone blinks.